We are here today with Alan Baxter, who is going to tell us all about the wonderful times with having no internet and writing books.
Hi, nice to see you. Not to see you, I should say.
That's all right. So tell us a little bit about yourself and what you're working on at the moment.
Sure. Well, yeah, I'm Alan Baxter. I live in rural Australia, which is why my internet is so poor and we're doing sound only for this. Um, I write a lot of dark fantasy and horror, mostly contemporary.
Okay.
The majority of what stuff that I do is sort of set like in our world and our
Right.
time, but with all sorts of other worlds and weirdness and supernatural stuff going on around and behind the scenes, and sometimes subtle and sometimes completely not subtle. Um, and to varying degrees, some stuff like the Alex Kane series is a little bit more sort of towards the fantasy side of things, and books like Devouring Dark are a little bit more toward the horror side of things. But a lot of people refer to Clive Barker and the dark fantastique, and that's kind of my sandpit. That's where I like to play.
Okay.
And given what I'm working on at the moment, that's I'm working sort of on something along those lines. I've got this. It's a new standalone novel that I'm probably sitting at about the halfway mark now, maybe just a little more.
Mm-hmm.
And it sort of combines. It's a sort of a home invasion novel in as much as there's a bank heist that goes really badly wrong, and the guys involved in that go on the run and end up trying to hide in an old lodge in the middle of nowhere,
Oops.
thinking that there'll be no one there because it's off season. But the family who run the lodge have just turned up a month before
Aha.
before the season opens to start opening the place up. So instead of having this place that should be abandoned for the time being for them to hole up in, they turn up and there's a family there. So all of a sudden they're holding this family hostage. But there's something else there too. Their violence and their meanness wakes something up,
I
and
see.
that causes additional problems for everyone. So yeah, and so I'm just sort of right into the meat of that at the moment. Everything's sort of getting about as bad as it can get for all involved halfway through the book.
So everyone dies.
Not quite, but at this stage, it's not looking good for a lot of them.
Okay, good to know. So not everyone dies. All right, so it's not quite full-on Shakespearean tragedy where everyone but the narrator is killed in gruesome ways.
No, not quite. It's there's for I think horror especially it works best when there's an emotional core and there's a core of characters that you really care about. That's essential
Mm-hmm.
for all storytelling. But there also does need to be some element of hope and survival in it for you to sort of cling on to. In some ways, it makes the horror darker because I mean, if it's just horrendous and everyone's going to die and you know everyone's just going to die, then you just kind of switch to that mode. Whereas if you can root for people, if you know some people are going to get through it, or you hope some people are going to get through it, and you root for people, and I shouldn't use that word. Um, but especially in Australia, it means an entirely different thing. But if there are people that you think will survive and can care about,
Mm-hmm.
it kind of makes the horror worse, but it also makes the journey to the end a little bit more fulfilling if there's some level of hope involved. So I don't like to be entirely. Some of my short fiction is a little bit more sort of entirely nihilistic like that. In novel length work, I like to give people something of a payoff at the end, even if it's bittersweet or some sort of pyrrhic victory. At least there's something at the end.
I can understand that, but then I'm always fond of a good villain. So
Yeah, well, me too. I mean, any story is only as good as its antagonist, really, as far as I'm concerned. And so I
exactly.
get really tired of stories with real sort of cardboard cutout villains. The villain is the hero of their own story. They have to be as complex and as realized as every other character. And when that's done well, then yeah, that's tremendous. I'm enjoying the bad guys in this current work. There's various degrees of bad guy, and the real worst one is just because he's losing the plot because everything's going so badly, and he was bad in the first place, so he's becoming entirely psychopathic, and it's quite enjoyable. It's quite good fun to write that character.
Yep, I think you're probably in the right genre then.
Yeah, exactly.
So how do you find switching between straight up horror and dark fantasy, because they are ever so slightly different.
They are, yeah. And it's weird because I can never pick it. I'm just hopeless at figuring out quite where I am on that scale. But like for example, the Alex Kane series was very much a dark fantasy.
Hmm.
But the second book in that series ended up nominated for the Aurealis Award for Best Horror Novel.
Aha.
And so I thought, okay, fair enough. And then I wrote a novel called Devouring Dark, which, as far as I was concerned, was entirely an urban horror novel. It
Right.
dark, and there is this sort of supernatural element to it, but it was dark and twisted, and it was a horror novel. And then it got nominated for the Aurealis Award for Best Fantasy Novel. So I have no idea what's going on
Well,
that front, and quite
at least other people can figure that one out, yeah?
yeah, that's exactly it. That's what I feel like. Like with sometimes with my short fiction, they are straight up horror stories, and they're a little bit sort of easier to focus that lens on. But I
Hmm.
think, to be honest, with my novel length stuff, at least so far, it always seems to lean into the dark fantasy, and that those fantastic elements might be more or less present, but they seem to sort of always be present. So
Right.
but yes, as I say, I'm a terrible judge really of what's horror and what's dark fantasy. I don't the line's very blurry to my mind. So
Right. Well, I mean, besides writing the blurb, picking the genre is actually rather difficult unless you're writing absolutely within the tropes and lines set and the most popular thing. I have a hard time picking that out.
yeah, and that's the thing for me as well. Because I've said this before many times. I've never met a genre I didn't like. So
Hmm.
I I tend to sort of throw them all in there. Most of the stuff that I do is primarily in that dark fantasy and horror area,
Right.
but I'm always throwing in elements of crime and mystery and noir and other things in there because those are the things I
Uh-huh.
love to read and I enjoy, and I love just mashing all that stuff together. So
Well,
it
yeah.
does become really difficult then when people say, well, what genre is it? It's like, well, I don't know. It's quite a lot. It appeals to crime readers, it appeals to
Hmm.
fantasy readers, it appeals to horror readers, and that's good as far as I'm concerned, because that's what I like to read, is that sort of slightly indefinable, weird genre. And that's
Yes.
so I guess that's what I write.
It makes it fun. That's for sure.
Yeah, yeah.
All right. As far as your short pieces go, do you find that easier to write than the full length novels, or is it just an entirely different medium? Because I know they are rather different developmentally wise.
Yeah, I mean, at the most basic level, they're fundamentally the same in as much as it's a story. It needs a
Mm,
beginning, a middle, and an end. It needs an arc. It needs character development. All those sorts of things that are involved.
right.
Um, where a short story is a really singularly focused lens, or often is, whereas a novel can be sort of much more sprawling, more characters, more subplots, other things going on. Um, so they become different beasts, and they're structurally, as you say, developmentally, they are different. I started in long fiction. The first things I wrote I mean, I wrote a lot of sort of short stuff
Hmm.
when I was just sort of cutting my teeth and finding my way. But when I started to take writing seriously, I started with novels, and I'd written a couple of novels, and then a lot of people were saying to me at the time, you should do some more short fiction because it's a good way to get your name out there and all that sort
Uh-huh.
of stuff. You get on editors' radars with those sorts of things, and especially in dark fiction, there is a fairly vibrant sort of scene for short fiction on that front. And
Hmm.
I've always been a huge fan of short stories. I first discovered short stories with Roald Dahl's short stories for
Oh,
adults
yeah.
when I was much too young to read those twisted things,
Well,
really.
you
But
know.
yeah, I thought they were fantastic. And then I discovered King's short stories. Then I read Barker's Books of Blood and blew my mind.
Hmm.
But I never really seriously considered trying to do that. I was always like, oh, I'm going to write novels. But then I decided, well, you know what? Maybe I should try to do that. So then I started trying to teach myself how to do it. And I went to a lot of writers' centers, and I sort of took courses and took advice and whatever else. Um, and it was when I started to realize that they are very different things to novels, even though fundamentally the same but very different
Hmm.
approach. That's when I started to sort of understand what made for good short fiction, and then I really got into it and I really enjoyed it. And being a fan of reading it for so long anyway, once I started to find my way writing it, I started to really enjoy it, and so now I can't sort of I can't stop it now. My second collection of short stories is coming out next month, actually, and
very cool.
That's really exciting. My first collection won an award and was well received, and now I'm sort of a few years later getting around to a second one. So it's really great to have enough work out there that I can put together these sort of collected volumes of short stories, because it's I love the art form. I love the form of it. I really.
Yeah, it sounds great. Is there a least favorite part of the writing/publishing process?
The publishing bit, to be honest. A lot of people say, "Oh, I love writing, but I hate editing," or other people say, "Oh, I hate the first draft, but I love to edit." And none of that. I love all of it. I really enjoy the creative process of laying down that first draft. I love to go through and edit and polish and make it better and all those sorts of things.
Right.
But that whole sort of treadmill of submission and rejection and publication and then waiting for publication and all stuff like that, it's incredibly tiresome in its own way. It's sort of if you're getting published, it's a bit bit up yourself to say that you don't like the publishing process, because there's thousands of people who would gladly jump on to what I consider my problems. But it's just, I just find it's so slow. Publishing is such a massive part of publishing is waiting, and obviously there's a lot of rejection, and you just live with that. That's part of the gig. But that whole process can grow really tiresome when what you want to do is just keep working and get the new things out and keep writing and write some more. And hopefully you get to that point where your work's sort of popular enough and recognized enough that it does just get grabbed and published. Whether that's not the case for 99% of us, like most of us are, even when we're published, we're also being rejected, and a publisher that was really keen on one thing just turns down your next book and stuff like that. So yeah, that whole process is sort of an ongoing slog. But it's a absolutely necessary part of the process. There's nothing we can do about it. It boils down to the fact that I would love to just sort of quietly sit and write and just make my stories that I enjoy and not have to worry about that stuff. But you can't, obviously. you have to play that game. So
yeah, I think most of us would like to have that sort of a life, but the reality is something entirely different.
Yeah, so I don't have any problem with any of the writing process. I really enjoy all of the writing process, but a lot of the other sort of stuff around the business wears me down sometimes.
So on average, how long does it take to get you from beginning to end, finished product type of thing?
Well, it really varies. With novel length work at this stage, because I do some co-writing with David Wood in the US, we write these sort of action adventure, sometimes a little bit supernatural things.
Sure.
And we co-write those, and we try to make sure we write at least one book a year. And alongside that, I try to make sure I write at least one book just sort of my own, under my own name per year. So regardless of whatever else goes on, I always try to make sure I get written 2 books a year. Doesn't necessarily mean 2 books will come out in a year, of course.
Well,
last year I actually had 4 books came out, and then this year I've just got the one short story collection coming out next month. So it's like buses. That sort of, you wait for 2 hours, and then 3 buses show up at once, and then nothing shows up again for whatever. That's just publishing. But in terms of making the work, I try to make sure that I get at least one book of my own and one book with Dave per year, and then in between that, I'm always working on short fiction projects. And if I get to the end of a book, I tend to give myself a bit of a break by writing a couple of short stories before I dive into another big project. So, but then sometimes a book might overlap and into the next year, and it's being a dick, and I can't quite get it right, and the things like, so I put it aside for a few months, work on something else, and bring it back. So you can kind of lose track a little bit sometimes of how long things take in that front.
Oh yeah.
But often things have percolate in my brain, and by the time I actually sit down to write them, I've got a better idea of where it's going, and I can usually then sort of finish a project. It's not often I have to put one aside, but it does happen sometimes. So yeah, how long's a piece of string? But I try to do 2 books a year, one of my own and one with Dave. That's about as close as I can get to a schedule.
That works pretty well. I mean,
Hmm.
writing is one of those monsters that doesn't actually oblige like normal 9 to 5
Right.
jobs in terms of a
Absolutely.
schedule.
Yeah, I might have a 10,000 word week, and then the following week I might struggle to get 1,000 words down, and then yeah, anything in between. So yeah, it's enormously varied.
Yep, the perils of being a creative type.
Exactly. Yeah.
So how is co-writing going? Because I know, well, the time difference is probably a bit frustrating. But do you pick a character and write that character? Are you a chapter type, or is it more the Terry Pratchett, Neil Gaiman type production?
Well, when we first started, because Dave and I, we've known each other for a long time. We thought
Sure.
our styles and our audiences were different enough that there would be some overlap, but not that much. But that equally, what we wrote would probably appeal across the board. So we figured it would be a good idea to try to sort of combine our styles and
Mm-hmm.
potentially our audiences and see how things grew from there. And so the first couple of things that we did literally send them back and forth, doing like a chapter at a time. So I'd write a chapter, send it to him. He'd
Mm-hmm.
go through, give it a light edit, write the next chapter, and send it back. So I'd give his a light edit, write the next chapter, send it back. And then
Mm-hmm.
once we got to the end of a draft, we'd sort of go back and forth and polish it a few times a bit more. Um, and that was sort of okay. But
But
as we went on, we were just finding that it just wasn't quite gelling as comfortably as it could.
right.
Um, and Dave's got a real skill, especially with the action adventure type stuff, the sort of, like the sort of Da Vinci Code, Indiana Jones type storylines. We do that, a lot of that sort of stuff, but with monsters or with mythical objects or
Right.
whatever. And he's really good at plotting that stuff. So he's really good at sort of marking out the story beats. And when I write my own stuff, I don't plan and plot a lot. I write notes and
Mm-hmm.
I have a sort of loose outline, but otherwise I wing it.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas with Dave, we go in a lot more detail, and so we've ended up now where we found a method that works really well. That we'll Skype and chat and knock ideas back and forth, for some time,
Right.
narrowing down the shape and what the sort of the way we want the story to be and what kind of like main ideas we're working with, and then we'll go, right, let's do that. Then he'll go away, he'll do a bunch of extra research, and he'll put together a really detailed outline. So
Oh
sometimes,
my.
12, 14, 16,000 word outlines,
Oh wow.
chapter by chapter. So we call it draft 0.5. um, that's sort of what he'll do with a literal chapter by chapter breakdown of points, and then he'll send that to me, and then I'll sit down and I'll write the entire first draft of the book,
Right.
and then we'll then send that backwards and forwards a few times and sort of polish it up and figure it out and fix anything that needs fixing. And it works better that way. It's a bit more efficient. It's a bit less, instead of sort of losing touch with where you were, and
Mm.
maybe somebody goes, one of us goes away for a week and you kind of lose momentum. That doesn't matter now, because he puts together that 0.5,
Mm-hmm.
and when he's done, he sends it to me, and I can just concentrate on writing the book. Then I send it back to him, and it works better. So, and that for the
Yeah.
last several books now that we've done it that way, and it works well.
Sounds
So
like.
yeah.
So,
So that's working for us. Yeah, we'll keep going that way with it.
all right. I'm going to move a little bit sideways. Is there a
Ah.
story that you wish you had written, and you feel free to steal someone else's work for this one?
Now this is funny. Variations on this question do come up sometimes. Which book do you wish you'd written and stuff like that.
Mm-hmm.
Um, it's not. There isn't one that I really wish I'd written, because I really feel like anyone who writes the stories only they can write.
Mm-hmm.
There are books that I think are just outstanding, and they blow my mind with how well realized they are and the complexity that the authors managed to pull off. And
Right.
you sort of book you read and go, well, shit, why do I even bother? Look at this thing. Um, but even then, I don't really feel like I wish I'd done it. But I do. I do hope that I can create something that makes other people feel that way about my stuff as that book made me feel about
Mm-hmm.
that author's work, if you know what I mean. And so,
Sure.
there's probably my favorite book of all. I'm a huge Clive Barker fan,
Uh-huh.
unashamed Barker fan. And my favorite novel of his is The Great and Secret Show. which
Ah,
I think is just an outstanding work of dark fantasy and horror, and the way that that story is constructed and the way it's developed, and it's just absolutely outstanding. And so I there's no story that I wish I'd written, but
mm-hmm.
I would really like to, if I haven't yet, I would like at some point to write a book or books that make people feel the way Great and Secret Show makes me feel. That's kind of what I would
All right. So
aim
you would rather steal someone's ability as opposed to their story.
maybe that's it. Yeah, like, yeah. So if I can ever be considered one day half the writer that Barker is, I'll consider myself accomplished.
Well, there you go. That'll work.
Yeah.
Seems perfectly in line with the dark fantasy slash horror. Instead of stealing a thing, you'd steal a person. But okay.
There you go. Right. Yeah.
All
But
right.
yeah, Barker's a huge influence on me as well, right from the Books of Blood as well. You know, people like Gaiman and King and Ursula Le
Right.
Guin and all these different people have been massive influences on me anyway. So I suppose it's only natural that that's where I sort of lean and that's what I emulate in a way.
Right. Well, it doesn't surprise me in the slightest. But go for it.
Yeah. Yeah.
Alrighty. So you've got your short story collection, and you've got the Devouring Darkness. That's the one.
The Baron Dark. Yeah.
Devouring Dark, and then the third one is which one again?
Well, so over the course of things, like my main works, I've got the Alex Kane series, which is a
Alex
trilogy.
Kane. Right. Thank you.
That was okay. That's a trilogy. I mean, people do keep asking if there will be more in that series, and you know,
Mhm.
never say never. The trilogy is a completed arc, but there is definitely scope for more,
Right.
more in that. So you never know. Maybe it will be. And then my two most recent novels are Hidden City
Hmm.
and Devouring Dark, both of which are standalone
Right.
standalone novels. So yeah. And yeah, my Crowshine was my first short story collection, and now my
Hmm.
second one is Surf Cold. That's coming next month. So, and there's a
Right.
couple of novellas in there as well that got published over the years. There's a novella called The Book Club and another one called Manifest Recall,
Hmm.
um, that follow sort of similar but different themes, like police procedural and sort of a gangster Southern Gothic in the case
Right.
of Manifest Recall.
Right.
Yeah.
I know you like to set these in the real but not quite real world. So how
Yeah.
much research do you put into that, or is it just off the top of your head?
Well, one of the things I like the most about writing fiction is the stuff it forces me to learn,
Hmm.
especially writing in you know, in contemporary settings. You got to get stuff right, because the more of the real world stuff you get right, the more people will buy the weird and the fantastic and whatever that you put in there.
Right.
Uh, so a lot of the time, so I do a lot of research. Like, for example, I mentioned that novella, The Book Club, that came out a couple of years ago. Um, I wrote myself into a corner a couple of times with that because of the way that it was set up. It's basically the story of a guy whose wife doesn't come home from a book club one night, and so he starts to worry, he starts to panic. The more he looks for her, the more weirdness he gets sort of dragged into. But it's written alongside the police investigation of her as a missing person,
Aha.
uh, and I kept running into real issues with that, because I would try to set up a situation for him, only to discover that, well, no, the police actually would do this, that, and the other, and that wouldn't happen. And so I kept calling. Fortunately, I've got a couple of mates in the police force.
Oh, there you go. That worked.
Yeah, they're always happy to sort of chat to me, and sometimes they're like, "You're writing a book, right? That's why you're asking me this stuff." It's like, yeah. Promise this is for a book.
Yes.
But they're very helpful. They're very useful to me, and they were telling me about, you know, triangulating cell phone signals
Mhm.
and stuff like that for this story to work the way I wanted it to. But so that you know, that's one that required a lot of research on that front, which was great fun, because I got to learn about police procedure in terms of how they would go about looking for missing people, and
Sure.
yeah, and other things like with Hidden City. In the first instance, there's this weird sort of fungal growth that spreads through the city that's sort of parasitic and starts affecting people and turning them into these homicidal maniacs. And that's actually a symptom for something far bigger that's going on. But that's the sort of process at the start of the book.
Mhm.
And so for that, I needed to really understand the life cycle of various parasites and how they would work, and how various fungus would work, to make sure that I was getting this stuff right. Because, you know, you'd have some biologists come along and go, well, that's just, you know, completely unfeasible. And obviously a fungus that turns someone into a homicidal maniac is unfeasible to a degree, but if you
Well,
base it in a in a like realistic fungus and a life cycle that biologically works, then people will buy it a bit more, and it makes it more frightening because of course you make it more possible. So yeah, I did. There's some weird stuff out there, man. When I started looking into the process of parasites and the effects they can have and everything else out of it, so I learned a lot about parasites and fungus for that book. So.
It's a little bit disturbing how many small things can cause problems, but
man, yeah. And you look at things like the cordyceps virus that gets in ants and stuff like that, and that's a fungal infection of the brain that makes them basically turns them into zombies to do whatever the virus wants them to do, the parasite wants them to do and stuff. It's kind of terrifying.
Yep, a little bit. But then there are a few things that I refuse to write about, and that is one of them, bugs. I can do parasites, I can do spiders, snakes, etc., whatever, but bugs ain't happening.
Oh, there you go. Yeah, well, I guess we've all got those blank spots. I'm no fan of spiders, but I wouldn't want to write about giant spiders devouring people or something like that, because I'd have trouble writing about that. Too much into my own phobias.
Well, that one just an image popped into my head of one of the 1950s B movies with the giant spider that looks like a puppet and the people screaming. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and in the B movies with the bad effects and stuff, then it's kind of funny. But when you write a book and the effects are real as your imagination, then it's hard.
Not so much. Oh yeah. And do you often find a disjoint between books and movie portrayals? Because I know genre-wise, horror movies don't always line up with horror novels.
No, and to a degree, there's a lot of the stigma from around surrounding horror comes from movies, especially because of that sort of 80s 90s boom of slasher horror. And people say, oh, what do you write? I write horror, and their brain immediately goes to slasher movies, and they're like, oh, I don't like that stuff, all blood and guts. And it's like, actually, that's just such a superficial veneer of what horror can be, especially literary horror when it's written in any format, short or long fiction. It explores so many more themes than just serial killers, and it can be so deep, and it can there's horror that can be absolutely beautiful and heartbreaking, and it runs the gamut. And so that I'm a fan of horror movies. I enjoy slasher movies too. There's a place for them in the whole sort of genre. It's great. But it does sort of bother me that a lot of the time people's idea of horror is limited to that, when actually there's so much more. And I always try to take the opportunity to say, oh well, look, you should read this or you should read that. This is what horror can be. Yeah.
I would absolutely agree. I have a hard time with the movies, probably because the visual effects, but the books tend to be just grand, especially when they get into the psychological bits.
Yeah, that's it. When you get the cool sort of supernatural and the weird, twisted psychological stuff that you can really get deep inside character and inside emotion with books that you can't get with just that sort of two-dimensional medium of film. It's much harder to get into that kind of depth. And so that stuff in horror novels is just, it's awesome. It's really good.
Right. So for people trying to get into your genre, are there any traps that they should avoid?
Well, I don't know. There are a lot of cliches, but then even the most tired cliche can really be turned on its head with given the right treatment. I mean, a good example is Stephen Graham Jones wrote a novel called Mongrels, which is absolutely outstanding. It's basically a werewolf book. It's a werewolf, and that's one of those things. It's like, isn't that just so tired now? But it was genuinely original, and it was so well written, and it absolutely redefined, for me, it redefined the possibilities of werewolves. And so I think it's the same really with horror as for all genres. The best thing you can do is read as widely as you possibly can in the genre that you want to write, so you really know what's going on in that genre, and at the same time read as widely as you can across all genres, just to generally inform and improve your craft, and then try to find the ideas that really appeal to you, and the things that only you can do the way you can do them. So and early on, I think when a lot of people, when they're starting out, they do tend to fall into cliche, and they tend to fall into those traps because it's the easy way. And but the more you develop your ideas, the more you develop your voice, the more you sort of tangent off and find new ideas. Someone once said to me that when you start writing, the first idea you have, throw it away, because that's the same anyone can have. And every time you come to a little sort of plot point and you're trying to figure out a way around it, as soon as you go, oh, that would be cool, go, right, okay, throw that away, I need to think of another one. Because you got to get under the surface and dig in and find something a little bit left of center that is more interesting than so maybe that's part of it. And especially with horror, it can be very easy to sort of find ways through that sound cool, but they only sound cool because they're a little bit tried and true. And that, if you can really turn that on its head, then great. But if you can't, find something a bit different. So
that's always the tricky bit, though.
That is exactly that's the process of, and a lot of the time, you got to write that not so good one first to get it down, and then as you go, I think you need to, that advice of when you finish something, you put it away for a while and then you come back to it is really valuable advice, because when you do come back to it, you spot those things where you took maybe the more obvious route or the more cliched route, and hopefully you sort of develop this internal critic enough that you can go, oh, you know what, that I can do better than that there, and I can make that more interesting. So yeah, hopefully that's what I'm always trying to do, and I don't know how successful I am, but it's always like, is that the best I can do? There's got to be a better way than that. So
yes.
try to change things up a bit.
Yes, well, I usually rely on people outside of my own head, because talking to myself can get very dangerous.
Yes, beta readers are worth their weight in gold. I'm lucky enough to have a handful of people who read for me, and we read for each other, obviously. And they're brutally honest and very, very smart, and I'm lucky to have them. They'll really, are you sure about this? Or come on, that's not good enough. Stuff like that.
Yep, absolutely. Well, is there anything else you would like to add, writing related or otherwise?
No, I don't think so. Other than if you're out there and you're writing, keep writing, because we need everybody's voice.
Yeah.
Don't get disheartened. It's a bullshit game a lot of the time, and it's hard, and it's kind of, it can be thankless, but the successful people are the ones who didn't quit, so don't quit.
Yeah. All right, so one last question. Tell us a little bit more about your short story collection coming out this next month.
Okay, so yes, that's called Served Cold. It's being published by Grey Matter Press, and it's out on, I think, the 17th of September, off the top of my head. I think that's right.
Okay.
So it's a collection of 16 short stories. 3 of them are original that haven't been published before, so they're brand new to the collection. One of those being a novelette, so it's a very long short story, well, not very long, but I think it's
longer.
I can't remember exactly, but it's something like 15,000 words. Yeah, so it's it's a longer story. And that particular story, somebody asked me to describe it, and the best I could come up with was Tasmanian Deliverance meets Stranger Things.
Okay then.
So kind of stand by that. I think that's quite a good description of it, as it turns out. So that's one of the original stories. The book's called Served Cold, which is named after the titles. The opening story in the book is called Served Cold, and that was a story that was published in the Dreaming in the Dark anthology that Jack Dan put together a couple of years ago. That anthology got nominated for the World Fantasy Award, actually, and my story got nominated for a couple of awards as well. And so I've got then, sort of 3 original stories and 13 other stories that were previously published in a variety of places. Some of them would have been a bit more well read, like that one from that anthology, and others were from anthologies that were maybe not so well known outside of maybe Australia. There was one was published in New Zealand, so that doesn't necessarily get a lot of international attention. One was actually published in the convention program. I was a guest of honor at GeyserCon in New Zealand earlier this year, and they asked me for original story. So they published that in the con book, but then it hasn't been seen anywhere else. So as far as sort of the general public are concerned, I guess that's almost another unpublished story as well. So like that, there's a whole range of different places that they've been to, different lengths of story in there, some very short ones and some longer short ones, and they all have various dark themes. Some are straight up horror, some are a lot more of the dark fantasy and sort of everything in between, hopefully. So hopefully it's a good showcase of my short fiction work. It's mostly mostly horror stories, but a lot of dark fantasy in it as well.
Right. Well, I'll have a look out for that. Sounds fascinating, and short stories
Yeah,
are always fun.
yeah, I think the sort of the cover will be released in a few days, and there'll be a pre-order link and all that sort of stuff. So it's all just about to go live, and yeah, the book's out in about 4 weeks. So
Okay, very
yeah,
cool.
yeah, exciting times. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for doing this. It was fascinating talking with you, and now I don't ever want to research parasites.
Yeah, well, I was going to say I advise against it, but it was genuinely fascinating. I fell down a research hole and I learned so many things, probably that I might be better off not knowing, but
Yeah.
it was genuinely fascinating. But it does make you a bit paranoid. But I've made my son wash his hands a lot more since I did that research than I ever did before.
Yeah. Some things I'd just rather not know.
Yeah, some things are better not known for sure.
All
But
right.
thanks for having me on. I've enjoyed it.
Yeah, thank you. And have a good evening / night, I guess. It's very early here, relatively.
Yes, yes, very very late here, so I'll go home and probably be heading to bed before too long. So time is a weird, strange thing.
Isn't it? Yep, absolutely.